Alright guys, today I'm going to be going over completing the square. Before I begin, I just want to do a quick review of solving by factoring. So I am going to, or using the square roots actually. So I'm going to just do what it says. It says solve the equations by factoring and then using the square root. So I'm going to factor this to be x and x. And I'm going to factor this to be 7 and 7. So in order to add to positive 14, I need both to be positive. And so I would get x plus 7 squared equals 4. So then I take the square root, because I'm solving using the square root property, and I would get x plus 7 equals plus or minus 2, because the square root of 4 is 2. If I subtract 7, I would get x equals negative 7 plus or minus 2. And now if I actually simplify this, negative 7 plus 2 is negative 5. So x equals negative 5. And negative 7 minus 2 is x equals negative 9. So these are the two answers I would get. Same thing here. I would factor what multiplies to 9 is 3 and 3. What multiplies to x squared is x and x. In order to get negative 6, both have to be negative. And I would get x minus 3 squared equals 20. If I solved this, I would take the square root. X minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 20. I could simplify this because that's 2 and 10, 2 and 5. I take out a 2, and I would have x minus 3 equals plus or minus 2 square root of 5. And the last thing is I would add that 3 to the other side. So x equals 3 plus or minus 2 radical 5. And now I can't simplify this like I did over here because the square root of 5, or 2 times the square root of 5, doesn't work out nicely. So I would get a decimal if I simplified any further. So I'm just going to leave it like that. So completing the square, these are the steps for it. And it's really important that you understand the steps as you read this. So it is possible to take any quadratic equation and create a perfect square trinomial, meaning something that looks like this, where you have x squared minus 3 equals a number, and then solve it in a similar way. So this method is called completing the square. So the first step in any equation is to rewrite it as ax squared plus bx equals c, which just means to move the constant to the other side. So I'm going to move the constant away. So if I'm looking at equation number 3 on here, I would subtract 56, and I would get x squared minus 18x equals 56, negative 56. Okay, if I looked at question number 4, that constant is already moved, so I'm already set up for step number 2. So let's see what step number 2 is. Step number 2 is to divide both sides by a so that it becomes x squared. So I want to get rid of the coefficient here. And in question number 3, the coefficient's already gone. So for question 4, I'm going to do exactly what it says to do. I'm going to divide everything by a, and that gives me x squared minus 8x equals negative 15. So step 3 says complete the square by taking half of b, square it, and add it to both sides. So I have b, I'm taking half of it, and I'm squaring it. And then it's really important that I remember I add this to both sides. So I'm going to continue with equation 4, or example 4, and you guys will finish example 3. For example 4, I'm going to take b, which is negative 8, divide it by 2, and square it. So I would get negative 4 squared. So what is that? 16. So I add 16 to both sides. Okay. And then step 4 says to factor the perfect trinomial. So just like we did in the warm-up questions there, we would factor this, and this would give me x and x, so 4 and 4. In order to be negative 8, I have to make them both negative. And on this side, I just get 1. So once I factor that, I get x minus 4 squared equals 1. Now, another way to think about this is anytime you factor this perfect square trinomial, you're going to get x plus b over 2 squared because of what you've added to both sides. So this will work out every single time. So I didn't even necessarily need to factor this. I could have just plugged it into this part here, and I would have got, let's see, x plus, what's b? B was negative 8 over 2 squared. So that would give me x minus 4 squared. Well, hey, isn't that what I got here? So if you remember this part here, you can always plug in b there and simplify. So now that I've completed step 4 and I've factored the perfect trinomial here, I can move on to take the square root of both sides, and this will create the two cases. So I'll show you what that looks like. So let's take the square root of both sides, and that gives me x minus 4, because the square root and the square will cancel, equals plus or minus 1. So there are the two cases we have. The square root of 1 is 1, and then I solve both equations. So I'm going to add, there we go, I'm going to add 4 to the other side, and I would get x equals 4 plus or minus 1. So my two answers here, 4 plus 1. 4 plus 1 is 5, and 4 minus 1 is 3. So those are my two answers there. Alright, so the next example I'm going to do is example number 8. And I'm going to keep referring back to these steps. So step 1 is to move the constant. Step 2 is to divide by a. Step 3 is to add b divided by 2 squared. So I'm going to do that here. Step 1, move the constant. Done. Step 2, divide by the constant. Divide by the coefficient. And I get x squared minus 10x equals 23. Then I have to add b divided by 2 squared. So that's negative 10 divided by 2 squared. So negative 5 squared is 25. So add 25 to both sides. Now step 4, I'm going to go back up and check what it was. Step 4 was to factor the perfect trinomial. Step 5 was to take the square root, and step 6 was to solve. So factor. So this side here factors to be x, and it's b divided by 2. b divided by 2 is negative 5. On the other side, 23 plus 25 is 48. And I take the square root. X minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 48. I need to break down the square root of 48, so let's see. I'm trying to look for a perfect square that goes into there, and I know 4 goes into it, and that gives me 12. So I have 4 and 3. So this is a perfect square, and this is a perfect square. The square root of that is 2 and 2. So I take out 4, because I take out a 2 from here and I take out a 2 from here, or you can even see that the 4's repeat, so I take out that 4. And what's left is 3. So x minus 5 equals plus or minus 4 square root of 3. Add the 5 to the other side. I'm going to add the 5 in front, because I can't combine it here because there's a plus and a minus. So x equals 5 plus or minus 4 square root of 3. And I can't simplify this any further. I can't combine the 5 and the 4 because this one has a radical and this one does not. So there's my answer for that. And the last one I'm going to do is question 10. So step 1 is to move the constant, but that only really works when everything is on one side, right? So I need to move that 16 over first and then move my constant. So I would get 4x squared minus 16x equals negative 76. So what did I do? I subtracted the 16x to this side, and then I subtracted the 76 to this side. So the next step would be to divide by a. Divide by a, and I get x squared minus 4x equals 76 divided by 4, negative 19. So now I'm going to add b divided by 2 squared to both sides. So I get negative 4 divided by 2 squared, so negative 2 squared is 4. So add 4 to both sides. And my next step is to factor this. So I know that this is going to be x plus b divided by 2 squared equals, what is that, negative 15. So what is b divided by 2 here? So b is negative 4 divided by 2 would be negative 2. So negative 2. Or if I just factored this right here, if I just factored this, I would get the same thing here. So from there, take the square root, solve. Take the square root, x minus 2 equals plus or minus. There's a negative inside of my radical. Anytime there's a negative inside of my radical, I should know to take out the I. Right? You can't have a negative in there, so we pull out the I. The square root of negative 1 is I. And now I solve. So x equals, add 2 to both sides. And I get 2 plus or minus I radical 15, or square root of 15, and the square root of 15 does not simplify. So that is my final answer. So just a quick recap, what are our steps? So our steps are to get it into ax squared plus bx equals c. Then we divide by a. Divide by a. Then we add b divided by 2 squared to both sides. We factor, and then we solve. So it's really important you understand the steps to this. If you need to, rewind, rewatch, and good luck with completing the square.